Hi, I'm Adam Shepherd.
And I'm Jane McCallion.
Welcome to the ITPro Podcast, your weekly guide to the most important topics in the IT industry. And this week I am mourning the death of Congregate.
What is a congregate when it's at home?
Congregate is an online flash games portal similar to Newgrounds and various other sites of that nature, which sprung up in the early 2000s to host user-created flash content, games, short animations, that kind of thing. And Congregate has stopped accepting new submissions for games, which is a shame because it was a really vibrant kind of hub of creativity. It allowed kind of a lot of amateur and indie developers to get their work out there, to get feedback on it, to iterate on it, and crucially to actually earn some money from it through kind of ad revenue and stuff. And it's a real shame that that and the sites like it now don't really exist anymore.
So what has put this final nail in the coffin of Congregate then? Why isn't it taking any more submissions?
Well, there's a number of factors. I mean, partly the stranglehold of platforms like Google and Facebook on ad revenue, partly the rise of mobile apps, which have kind of made online games portals less attractive for this kind of thing, partly the death of Flash, although HTML5 has sort of become a viable replacement for that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's always a shame to see these kinds of indie platforms go under, but I guess things do tend to kind of congregate, if you excuse the pun, under like kind of massive platforms. And if it's easier to publish through one of the big developers like Apple or Google or whatever, and realistically probably get some revenue that way as well, then this is always what's going to happen.
I suppose, but it's still sad to see the old guard going the way of the dodo.
Well, the demise of online gaming platforms aside, later in the show we'll be talking about coding our way out of the COVID recession. But first, let's talk about this week's top news stories.
Our first story this week, the UK government has been urged to overhaul the Computer Misuse Act, which turned 30 this week.
Yes, so a coalition of businesses, industry organisations, academics, researchers, that kind of thing, they've all come together under the umbrella of CyberUp and written to the Prime Minister asking for the Computer Misuse Act to be overhauled, replaced. Basically, yes, it's 30 years old, this piece of legislation, and it's itself kind of was rushed out to bung a hole in the existing legislation, which didn't really cover hacking effectively or anything to do with intercepting communications in their electronic form. We have a whole piece on ITPro that we will link to for the background on this. But effectively, the way that it's written prevents white hat hackers from doing penetration tests, or it can do. In theory, they could be prosecuted for doing the job.
And I mean, this is a very old piece of legislation. It does seem slightly baffling that a 30-year-old law is being used to legislate an industry which is moving at incredibly rapid speeds, and it does lead to things falling through the cracks.
This is not the first time that an overhaul of the CMA has been called for. But this is a very particular angle, and admittedly, I think a valid one, that if there is a risk that white hat hackers could be prosecuted for doing their job, then they may not, they may choose not to do it, or occasionally people don't realise that this might include breaking into premises, or actually breaking into systems as if they were a hacker, rather than coming around and kind of tapping on the walls and stuff and going, "Yep, seems fine." Which kind of creates a greater risk, because weak spots aren't discovered, which then can have a knock-on effect in terms of mass data leakage, companies being brought down by ransomware, anything, that kind of thing. But it is a very particular angle to it, because, I mean, in my opinion, the Computer Misuse Act fundamentally does still have, a decent level of usefulness. Because, yeah, sure, technology moves fast, but when it comes to illegally accessing the data on a computer, there's still only so many ways of doing it. And if the law effectively says you can't do that, then that covers off what you need. But I am in agreement that there should be provisions made for people who are doing it on a professional level, or some kind of reassessment of the situation. I mean, the one thing I would say, maybe it's better to revise things sooner rather than later. There were 3 years passed between the landmark case that brought about the CMA and it actually being passed as an act of parliament. So who knows what will happen in the intervening X number of years between when we finally get some kind of revision going and it coming into force. So perhaps it's better to act sooner rather than later.
And in other news of updates, NHSX has offered a £3 million tender for the contract to phase out pager technology within healthcare.
Yes, so last year, Matt Hancock said that NHS England must phase out pagers by next year, 2021, and move to more modern communication tools. So this is part of that. The tender's been put out for the project. It stipulates that the replacement tech should not just be a messaging service, which effectively is what pages are, but should also offer image sharing, call functionality, and a staff directory linked to the global NHS address book. Optional extra features would be patient lists, task management, video calling, and ERP integration. Now, I tell you what, Adam, I don't know about you, but to me, that sounds an awful lot like a phone.
That does sound an awful lot like a phone, but also, there are many reasons why NHS staff can't just be given essentially a work phone and asked to use that. I mean, not only do you have the issues around kind of mobile device management and all of the infrastructure and legwork that entails, but you also have security issues. I mean, we've had countless stories over the last couple of decades, really, of officials, government ministers, etc., leaving sensitive devices or devices containing sensitive information, on trains or in restaurants and things like that. And, if you've got a device that has essentially unfiltered access to a huge array of sensitive medical information, that's not the kind of thing that you want to risk somebody accidentally mislaying. Not to mention the fact that phones can and usually are germ factories, which is not really ideal for a healthcare scenario.
I mean, I guess, but this is still going to be a device that you could, in theory, leave somewhere accidentally. I mean, I guess unless it's left in a locker or whatever. But if you were on call, presumably, you need to be able to be contacted. So, like I said, it sounds like a phone, or with all the ERP stuff, maybe a computer, just a small computer, which is a phone nowadays, really, isn't it? Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about this story. So it almost feels like they're trying to reinvent the wheel. Like I say, phones are a thing, and doctors do also use smartphones. And pagers, they fulfill a very specific niche, which is sending short messages of you need to quickly come to A&E or whatever. And this seems to be potentially unnecessarily complex. Also, interestingly, it's in theory they're going to be phasing out pages completely, apart from the fact that some pages will be kept around because they can function if the Wi-Fi goes off, for example, which kind of, I don't know, it's old technology. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad technology.
Well, you do have the security concerns. Late last year, for example, radio hobbyists intercepted and leaked live transmissions of pager info from North London hospitals, as well as ambulances and other things. It does have some advantages. It can function without Wi-Fi, for example, as you said. But there are significant advantages that can be had through modernization. And, it doesn't seem an inherently bad idea that the NHS should look at moving to a more modern system. Now, whether or not this contract will actually result in something cost effective and well delivered is a different thing entirely. I mean, we know that government contracts in general tend to go over budget, over schedule, and generally don't have the best track record of efficiency. But
yeah, I mean, there are other elements of this as well. Like it's supposed to be a connectivity thing, but I don't know when you were last in a hospital, but the level of black spots that there are there, because the walls are so thick and stuff, just the way that they are built, that pages also got round because they use low frequency radio waves. So I don't know. Like you say, I mean, it being a government IT project, who knows when we'll actually phase out, pages. Maybe we'll still be talking about this in 2025.
I mean, I would remind you that fax machines are still widely used within the NHS, but that's a different
that's another
story
hobby
altogether.
horse for us to get on at another time, yes.
Hmm.
Our final story is that Microsoft will upskill millions of workers for a post-pandemic future.
This is in response to the COVID outbreak, which has both highlighted and exacerbated the skills gap. By 2030, 800 million people will have needed to learn new skills to get and retain a job, it's predicted.
Yes, many of the groups that have been hit hardest by COVID, so people of colour, women, those in unskilled jobs, will also face the greatest threat of economic hardships in the coming recession, and are the same people who will need to learn those new skills in order to have a job. So it's a perfect storm, if you like. And for Microsoft, something needs to be done.
Microsoft's plan revolves around 3 pillars. The first is using data from LinkedIn to identify the most in-demand tech jobs, such as IT technicians, data analysts, and support desk operatives. It also includes a service to match people's skills to jobs and includes access to learning resources from sources like Microsoft Learn and LinkedIn's various educational tools.
Yes, and the company has also said it's going to partner with non-profit organisations to provide additional support for those who need it most. So this was all announced by Satya Nadella in a webcast. And I mean, I think it's great that they're stepping up to the plate. And it does seem to be a genuinely kind of progressive move. I mean, obviously, for a tech company, building the skills of more tech people who they will need in the future is probably no bad thing. Obviously it's not a direct Microsoft pipeline, but if you build the kind of ground level talent, then you have more people to choose from. But it's I've very little negative to say about this, and I'm an incredibly skeptical person.
It does seem like a sorely needed move for a start. I mean, as we've covered before on ITPro, there are a huge range of learning resources out there for those who want to learn tech skills and programming and things like that. But it can be quite hard, especially if you aren't familiar with the tech sector, to find those resources, but also, get a sense of what kind of skills you need. It can be bafflingly complex to actually work out what tech skills are going to, for example, land you that job at Microsoft, say, or even just what skills are going to be most useful in your own job in years to come. So bringing all of that information together into one place, I think, is going to be very, very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my main criticism would be that perhaps it's not, this is good, but it's perhaps not the role of, giant corporations to provide education and, kind of careers training and that kind of thing, that perhaps globally we should better fund and organise education. But that's just the socialist in me.
Well, yeah, and in the absence of any real kind of meaningful tech skills education at a global level, it's good to see somebody stepping up to the plate to provide that, at least.
Yeah, and it in all fairness, it is a knowledgeable organisation as well. But maybe other kind of tech companies will formalise any initiatives they've got and come out as well. Obviously, Microsoft has an advantage here because they own LinkedIn. And
well, quite.
Yeah, and they also own GitHub, which is also, will obviously link to the main story, but they're incorporated into this as well. So yeah, they have perhaps more standing in this particular area than rivals like Google or Apple or Amazon or whoever.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we will be talking about how we can code ourselves out of the looming economic crisis and why we may be seeing a startup boom off the back of COVID-19.
See you after the break. Welcome back. Now, it's no secret that the COVID public health crisis is leading into an economic one, with a recession on the horizon that could make 2008 look like a minor hiccup. But it's in these kinds of situations that we can find bursts of creativity and a booming startup scene.
Now, it's no secret that startups spike during times of economic hardship. We saw that during the 2008 recession, and we also saw it during the wobble, shall we say, in 2012. But this coming recession could be even bigger than both of those, as you mentioned. And we may actually see a bigger boom than all of those previous periods combined when it comes to startups and new tech companies.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth taking a very quick minute here to talk about that. So I'm the kind of nerd who listens to like a lot of economics stuff and reads economic stuff in addition to the kind of tech nerd stuff. And the COVID recession, the coming recession, whatever we end up calling it, is kind of different to the global financial crisis, to the 2012 wobble, to all the previous recessions, because it's kind of not an economic recession. It is, but like it's been imposed because we've had to shut down business because otherwise you've got like millions of people dying. And so I think that it's worth bearing that in mind when we talk about what's going to happen and the recovery from it and the kind of businesses that we're going to see created, especially when people start talking about the new normal, that these businesses presumably are going to serve some element of that, do you think?
Absolutely. And I think beyond that, the ways in which the new normal is starting to manifest complement the existing advantages that startups have. You know, it's frequently said that startups thrive in economic turbulence because they're smaller, leaner, more agile than their larger, kind of more established counterparts. They can adapt better to changing situations, and they aren't weighed down by large legacies, not just legacy technology, but also, legacy processes and organizational structures.
Yeah, I was going to say they don't have that kind of baggage of, whether that's like an office or some existing assets or the way that they did business. If you are just kind of like being born in chaos, then you can you can make that chaos your own. It's not something you're having to deal with. It is your reason for being, she said, very kind of like classical literary way.
You merely adopted the recession. I was born in it, molded by it.
Oh!
I didn't see economic stability until I was already a man.
As well, it shouldn't be discounted the fact that, as I mentioned, there are going to be a lot of people looking for work, and that includes more people with tech skills than there ever have been previously. The tech industry has grown immeasurably since 2012, and a lot of those people with app development skills, software engineering, cloud skills are going to be looking for jobs, and a good chunk of them will likely want to go it alone, whether that's through a lack of jobs for them to go into or just, entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those things that, layoffs and that kind of thing, in some people, they've always kind of, wanted to strike out on their own, but never, there's a lot to be said for stability. I'm sure everyone's feeling that right now, but, so taking a step into the unknown, especially if you've got some kind of responsibilities, but if you're kind of shoved in that direction that you were kind of thinking of anyway, then I don't know if maybe that's one of the reasons why startups flourish in this kind of environment as well, is that there are people who would otherwise, who had good ideas, but would have otherwise, kept them to themselves because they preferred stability over risk, whereas now there's an opportunity to give it a shot.
And on top of that, it's now easier than ever to start a startup, if you like. Remote working is now accepted and the norm in a way that it, never has been previously. For similar reasons, cloud tools are now more widely available and more widely understood than ever. As we've already covered, coding talent is now, abundant in previously unheard of levels. So all of the ingredients are there. If you want to start something from the ground up, you have easy access to talent. You don't need to be based in an office, and you won't be, at a disadvantage for not having an office. And you've got barrels of, newly available coding talent now that is just looking for something to do.
And not just coding talent, even tech businesses need administrators and that kind of, people who keep the whole thing together, whether you like it or not. That may not be the bit that you see in tally shows and that, but you still need somebody helping out in the background as well. I mean, I'm about to demonstrate why, I am not an entrepreneur and do not have an entrepreneurial spirit. But what kind of, kind of concretely, what kind of startups would you see coming out of this? Because to my mind, a lot of the niches are already filled. So when it comes to food delivery, we all already have, Deliveroo or Just Eat and, Uber Eats and other delivery services are available. Or, local to me, a few local businesses, one of which already did some, home delivery. It's a fruit and veg or a greengrocer, if you like. They, hooked up with some other local businesses that they knew, and now they deliver for all of them. So we already have Zoom and Google Hangouts and Skype, and a lot of what I think that we need for the new normal, in inverted commas, we have.
Well, that's the beauty of startups, isn't it? A lot of companies create their own niches. I mean, look at things like Deliveroo and, Uber and Uber Eats and whatnot. Before they came along, you would have said, we've got taxis or Domino's or whatever, insert pre-existing company here. We don't need a new thing to do that, but a new thing came along nevertheless and proceeded to revolutionize that particular industry or segment. And there is absolutely no reason why we won't see the same thing happen here. Like as not, we will have a company that comes along and provides a service that nobody knew that they needed, but as soon as it becomes available, becomes absolutely vital and transformational.
The Steve Jobs school of entrepreneurialism. Give people things that they didn't know that they needed.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
And when needs are rapidly changing in the way that they are now, I can absolutely see a huge amount of new needs that people have that they didn't, that they don't know that they have, and that existing companies aren't really set up to cater for.
Do you know what I could see, actually? I say, looking to my left, to my bookcase, is mobile libraries, like a resurgence of mobile libraries. Sounds like a really odd thing to say, but I could see somebody setting up a business that, brings round books for you to lend, probably for, a fee if it's a startup rather than run by the council or whatever. Because people don't want to or can't, whatever, go to the library.
Well, a lot of libraries don't exist anymore.
Be right back. VCs, drop me a line. You can find me on Twitter at Jane McCallion. Off to start a mobile library.
Well, speaking of VCs, that's another reason why we could well be seeing an explosion of startups coming up. VCs still have a lot of cash to invest, even in climates like this, and they are still wanting to invest, particularly in, new businesses that might be able to take advantage of the current situation that, existing businesses might not be able to.
Yes, a sneak peek actually of something coming up in the next edition of ITPro 2020, our digital magazine. So not the one that's out this week, but the one that will be out at the end of this month. We have something on that very thing. And I have read some very interesting quotes in that about VCs, that they still want to spend their money. They still want to invest. A good business environment is good for business. It's the rising tide lifts all boats, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I can see why VCs are still interested. And actually, even if you don't want to go down the venture capital route, there's social investing, there's crowdfunding, there's lots of other different things, depending on what angle you're taking with your startup as well.
And in addition to that, it's if you want to develop an app or a site or what have you, you don't even necessarily need a big team of coders in order to get it off the ground. We've seen a huge range of low-code, no-code platforms, not just apps and services, but also websites, tools like Squarespace and Shopify and all those kind of things that make it incredibly easy to set up and deliver a service or application with very minimal actual hard programming knowledge necessary. Make it really easy for new startups to get up and running without needing to shell out huge amounts on development teams.
So, there's always a danger when we talk about, places being awash with money and people just throwing all their money at, startups and everything going a bit wild. You do start to think about bubbles, so the dotcom bubble, other bubbles, South Sea bubble, that kind of thing. Is there a potential for that people are just going to throw their money into stuff and everything's going to get overhyped and then it collapses back in on itself, do you think?
Not really. The dotcom bubble was a particular set of circumstances, notably an entirely new field, pretty much, of businesses, an entirely new category of companies. Tech companies and internet companies weren't really a huge force in the market in the way that they were before the dot-com boom. Whereas this coming startup boom that we're predicting isn't really likely to be establishing an entirely new category of companies and services. It's more going to be an evolution of the existing market. So I don't think there's any real danger of bubble.
So, okay, say I want to start my mobile library 2.0 or whatever. How do you go about starting a startup?
Well, there's a number of resources available that you can turn to for advice on the kind of nuts and bolts of actually starting a startup. Things like incorporating yourself, registering with Companies House, getting your kind of finances and payroll in order, all of that kind of stuff. But really the first step is have an idea and execute it. Build a minimum viable product. Actually get a small team together, your core founding team, if you like. Have the idea, flesh it out, and then build a minimum viable product.
Well, Adam, I think that we have had an excellent discussion, and like I say, I'm off to start my life as a librarian. You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as on Facebook and LinkedIn. You can also download the latest edition of ITPro 2020, our digital magazine, by following the link in the show notes.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts to never miss an episode. And, if you can, leave a rating and review.
We'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT, but until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.